23 killers, 7 levels. We'll start with the more eerie and well-known, but as we descend, the killers will grow increasingly disturbing and unsettling. This is the ultimate twisted killer iceberg. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. H.H. Holmes. So picture this, it's 1893 in Chicago and everyone's excited about the World's Fair. People are amazed by the first Ferris wheel, electric lights, and all that jazz. But while the city was buzzing with excitement, a man named H.H. Holmes was busy cooking up pure evil. This guy wasn't just your average crazy killer. No, Holmes was the LeBron James of fraud and the Picasso of murder. I mean, he was so devoted to his killings that he built a literal murder castle, a 3-story labyrinth of doom disguised as a hotel. This hotel looked like your run-of-the-mill Victorian-era lodge from the outside, cozy, elegant, a perfect place for weary travelers. But once you stepped inside, you were basically in a real-life escape room, except the only way out was, well, there wasn't one. It was riddled with hidden rooms lined with gas lines, trapdoors, and even a crematorium. Holmes would lure people in, especially single women looking for work, tourists eager for adventure, and business partners who trusted him. And once inside, well, let's just say if Yelp had existed, the reviews would be terrifying. Now, aside from being a crazy psycho killer, he was a world-class scammer. He faked medical degrees, married multiple women under different names, and would then take out life insurance policies in their names before they'd vanish like smoke. Eventually, Holmes' scam web got tangled. I mean, you can only kill so many people before someone notices. And it turns out insurance companies don't love it when the same guy keeps filing life insurance claims like he's collecting coupons. In 1894, Holmes was finally arrested for fraud, not murder at first, because they didn't even know what the guy was up to. But as investigators poked around his castle, they realized the guy was a full-on psychopath. They found human remains, bones, and enough evidence of horror to make a horror movie director really uncomfortable. Holmes was convicted of murder eventually, and in 1896, he was hanged. The guy even had the guts to use the worst line in the book. The devil made him do it. And apparently his only devil and his only regret was getting caught. Elizabeth Bathory. Born in 1560 in Hungary, Elizabeth Bathory was a noblewoman, a wife, a mother, and, oh yeah, a serial killer. But not just any serial killer, no. She was the Guinness World Record holder for most prolific female murderer. A title nobody really competes for except maybe in horror movies. You see, Mrs. Bathory married Count Ferenc Narasti when she was 15, and he was a tough guy, nicknamed the Black Knight, because of how brutally he handled his enemies in battle. And while Ferenc was off fighting wars, Elizabeth decided to, stay busy. And by stay busy, I mean systematically torturing and murdering young girls. Now, Countess Bathory didn't just kill her victims. That would be too basic. No, she got creative. Sometimes she'd stab them repeatedly with needles just to see them squirm. Then, when that became boring, the poor servants would be forced to stand outside naked in the freezing cold until they turned into human popsicles. Other times, she'd pour boiling water on victims or systematically bite flesh off of girls' faces and shoulders. Then, of course, there's the bloodbath rumor. She would butcher and drain the blood of the bodies of virgins, then bathe in them because, in her twisted brain, that would keep her young and beautiful. The killing got so bad that even King Matthias II of Hungary got involved. And when he sent investigators to check out Csatiste Castle, it was a horror show. They found dozens of bodies, some buried, some stuffed under furniture. Prisoner girls are still alive but covered in cuts and bruises and barely hanging on. There were even buckets and gallons of blood in the basement. You'd think she'd be executed immediately, but nah. Elizabeth was still a noble, and back then, nobles played by different rules. So instead of a beheading or a bonfire send-off, they walled her up inside her castle. That's right, they bricked her into a room with just a tiny slot for food. No visitors, no fresh air, just her and her murderous thoughts. She lasted 4 years before dying in 1614. And with that, Hungary's scariest beauty influencer was gone. The West Mesa Bone Collector. The West Mesa Bone Collector was this unknown person responsible for the murders of 11 women and one unborn child, whose remains were discovered in 2009, buried in the desert on the west side of Albuquerque. And here's the real kicker: these murders happened between 2001 and 2005, meaning the killer had years of head start before anyone even knew what was going on. That's like turning in your homework 5 years late and still getting away with it. In fact, the only reason these bodies were found was because a massive housing development project got cancelled. The land that was supposed to be covered in shiny new houses was instead left empty, which meant when a woman walking her dog in 2009 stumbled upon a human bone, police had a chance to investigate before it was turned into someone's backyard. The chilling part about these murders was that the women found buried in the West Mesa were young Hispanic women in their 20s and 30s, many of whom had a history of drug use and sex work. And because they were from vulnerable backgrounds, their disappearances didn't get much attention at first, even though their families reported them missing. Many cases still went cold. Now, you'd think that a guy who buried 11 bodies in the desert would have left behind a neon sign with his name on it, but no, this dude was as slippery as a greased-up lizard. First, the police were already years behind, so there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no obvious murder weapon, and even the burial site had been disturbed by construction projects, which made evidence collecting a nightmare. Sadly, to this day, the West Mesa Bone Collector remains unidentified, making this one of the biggest unsolved serial killer cases in the US. Jane Toppan. Imagine you're lying in a hospital bed, feeling a little under the weather, when a friendly nurse walks in, smiles sweetly, tucks you in, and promises to take extra good care of you. Sounds comforting, right? Wrong, because if this were the late 1800s and that nurse was Jane Toppan, you better start reciting your will. This is because this so-called angel of mercy was actually the angel of death. This lady was basically a full-blown syringe-wielding serial killer with a hobby of playing God. Initially, Jane Toppan was born Honora Kelly in 1857, but she didn't exactly start life on the right foot. Her father was a shoemaker who literally went insane, like sewed his own eyelids shut insane. And after that, she was dumped in an orphanage and later taken in as an indentured servant. But as she grew up, Honora reinvented herself by first changing her name to something less Irish-sounding. So she landed on Jane, and then decided to pursue nursing. Unfortunately, instead of Florence Nightingale, we got Florence Frightingale. So after her studies at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts, where she quickly gained a reputation for being super friendly, overly chatty, and just a little too fascinated with death, she landed a job as the smiling, helpful, bedside manner queen at a very prestigious hospital. For a while, things were going smoothly, until people started dying. A lot. You see, Jane didn't just kill, she took her time. She'd mix morphine, which slows the heart, with atropine, which speeds it up, creating a horrific chemical roller coaster inside her victims. They'd suffer in agony while she sat at their bedsides studying them like a scientist who flunked ethics class. And if that's not disturbing enough, she didn't just watch them die, she climbed into bed with them, cuddled them, and whispered in their ears as they slipped away. Because, according to her, her favorite part was the thrill that moment between life and death gave her. People finally started getting suspicious when she tried to move in with a grieving husband after poisoning his whole family. And by suspicious, I mean they finally noticed that everyone she touched mysteriously died. She was eventually caught and arrested in 1901, where she openly admitted to killing over 100 people, bragged about how much joy it brought her, and even tried to plead insanity by saying she wanted to be the greatest serial killer of all time. And the craziest part is that it worked, because instead of the death penalty, she was sent to the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she spent the rest of her life. David Berkowitz, son of Sam. David Berkowitz, whose real name was Richard David Falco, was an adoptee who grew up in the Bronx, and his childhood was not exactly sunshine and lollipops. As a little boy, David was obsessed with fires and got into trouble constantly. Plus, he had the social skills of a wet sock, so that made making friends a very difficult task. To make matters worse, his adoptive mother died and everything just went downhill from there. He eventually joined the army, but instead of finding discipline and purpose, he found guns and a taste for blood, which is a dangerous mix for someone who already has a few screws loose. Now, after leaving the military, David spiraled further into loneliness, and it was at this point that he started talking to his dog, which apparently gave him explicit instructions to go into the world and kill people. Yep, you heard that right. This man believed that his neighbor's Labrador retriever was telling him to kill people. A whole serial killer career launched because this dude couldn't tell the difference between a demonic command and a dog just barking for food. Well, this launched the beginning of the terror that plagued New York between 1976 and 1977. David, who quickly rebranded to Son of Sam, would specifically target young couples in their cars, basically making out a death sentence. Now, aside from the fact that this guy just hated couples in love and was literally the worst, deadliest third wheel, he also thought it was a smart idea to send taunting, creepy letters to the police and press with words like, "I am a monster, I am the son of Sam." Well, at least he was self-aware. Thankfully, the crazy man was finally caught because of a parking ticket. Apparently, the NYPD was looking for a yellow Ford Galaxy near one of the crime scenes. Turns out, Berkowitz had parked illegally that night, and one dumb parking ticket later, the police tracked him down. When they went to his apartment, it was like a true crime fan's nightmare. The walls were covered in crazy scribbles, satanic messages, and enough disturbing material to make Netflix drool over a future docuseries. He was arrested on August 10, 1977, and after pleading guilty, Berkowitz was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. Level 2. Stephen Griffiths, crossbow cannibal. So, you see, Stephen Griffiths wasn't your run-of-the-mill serial killer. Oh no, this guy wanted to be extra. So he wasn't content with just killing, he made sure people knew he was a monster. Nicknamed the crossbow cannibal, Griffiths killed 3 women between 2009 and 2010. Suzanne Blamiers, Shelley Armitage, and Susan Rushworth, all of whom were vulnerable sex workers. What made this guy scary was his preferred method of killing because it was as brutal as it was horrifying. He would lure them into his car, drive them to remote locations, and then ask them to run. Then he'd hunt them with a crossbow like it was some sort of sport. And that's not even the worst part, because after he shot them dead with the crossbow, Griffith would then proceed to butcher them and eat parts of his victims. Yep, this guy went full Silence of the Lambs, minus the sophistication. Well, thankfully his downfall came from one of the most bizarre and idiotic ways possible. He murdered someone on camera. That's right, guys, on camera. The psychopath was caught in 2010 after security footage inside his own apartment building captured him attacking Suzanne Blamiers, who he shot in the head with his infamous crossbow. A maintenance worker saw the footage, immediately called the police, and boom, Griffiths was toast. Once arrested, he went full psycho in the interrogation room, referring to himself as the crossbow cannibal like he was auditioning for a new horror franchise, and even openly bragged about eating his victims and drinking their blood. He pleaded guilty to all 3 murders in 2010 and was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Anthony Garcia. So just imagine you're lying in a hospital bed, fresh out of surgery, when a nurse comes to reassure you that the doctor who operated on you knows his onions. But what she doesn't know is that Dr. Garcia isn't just skilled at wielding a scalpel, but he's also exceptionally good at holding a grudge. And unfortunately for some unlucky souls, his revenge was delivered with surgical precision and murder. Basically, Anthony Garcia was a failed doctor with an oversized ego and the emotional stability of a broken thermometer who had trained as a would-be pathologist. But then his villain arc started in the early 2000s when he was kicked out of Creighton University's pathology residency program because of poor performance and unprofessional behavior. Basically, he wasn't fit to diagnose a rash, let alone handle something as serious as human anatomy. Now, did Garcia take this career-ending L and move on? Of course not. That would require emotional maturity, and this guy had none of that. So instead, he spent years brewing a hatred so deep, it turned into a full-fledged murder spree. He started by brutally stabbing the 11-year-old son and housekeeper of Dr. William Hunter, who was apparently one of the guys responsible for getting him kicked out of the residency program. Then, 5 years later, he struck again, and this time went after another former boss from Creighton, Dr. Roger Brumbach, and his wife, Mary. The couple was found murdered in their Nebraska home with Dr. Brumbach shot and Mary brutally stabbed. Again, the connection to Creighton University made it clear someone was out for revenge, so when the cops finally started putting two and two together, they realized that both murder cases had one thing in common: Dr. Anthony Garcia, the resident dropout turned revenge-seeking psychopath. The psycho doctor was finally tracked down and put in cuffs in 2013, and after he was tried and found guilty, Garcia was convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Beverly Allett. Born in 1968 in Lincolnshire, England, Allett was one of those kids who seemed a little too into playing doctor. As she grew up, she developed a history of seeking medical attention for herself and would often fabricate illnesses just to get sympathy. She'd wear bandages over non-existent wounds, insist she needed treatments she didn't, and probably faked a cough in school just to skip math tests. Now, this self-destructive pattern is a telltale sign of Munchausen syndrome, a condition where people feign illness for attention, and later, experts would suspect she had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, MSBP, which is a much deadlier version where someone induces illness in others to gain sympathy and praise. Sadly, once she became a nurse, this was exactly what she did to the children in her care. She would inject them with enough insulin to cause hypoglycemia. Sometimes she'd give the poor kids potassium injections leading to heart failure. And other times, she'd inject air into their bloodstream, which is as lethal as it sounds. And here's the worst part: Allett often struck when the child was just about to recover. One minute a toddler was giggling and playing, and the next they were gasping for air, their little bodies shutting down mysteriously. Parents were left in shock, doctors were baffled, and Beverly? Well, she was always conveniently right there, ready to help. Eventually, an investigation was launched after healthy children kept dropping like flies left, right, and center, and soon enough, someone put two and two together and realized that every suspicious case had one thing in common: Beverly Allett was always on shift when these tragedies happened. She was arrested after police found sufficient evidence to link her to all the baby murders, but at trial she showed zero remorse, zero empathy, just a blank stare like a serial killer Barbie doll. She was convicted of 4 murders, 3 attempted murders, and 6 counts of grievous bodily harm, and was sentenced to 13 life terms in 1993. Nanny Doss. Right from childhood, Nancy Hazel grew up in a very strict household under the rule of her overbearing father, who made it his life's mission to ensure she had no fun, no friends, and no dreams beyond cooking, cleaning, and birthing children. To make things worse, Nanny suffered a head injury at age 7 when a train suddenly stopped, causing her to hit her head on a metal bar. But despite a rough childhood, Nanny was a hopeless romantic. She spent her free time reading true romance magazines, dreaming of fairy tale love stories. However, the only problem was that every time she got married, her fairy tale ended with a poisoned dinner and a funeral. Now, everyone was baffled as to why sweet Nanny's husbands just kept dying mysteriously right after she married them. And it wasn't just limited to husbands, because her 2 children mysteriously died young, her 2 grandchildren accidentally died, one from poisoning, the other by falling off a porch, and even her mother, sister, and first mother-in-law all died suddenly and mysteriously. Basically, if you were related to Nanny and breathing, your life expectancy just plummeted. And the most disturbing part in all these killings was that she did them all very cheerfully. It was when she managed to kill her 5th husband, Samuel Doss, that people started to become suspicious. The man's doctor ordered an autopsy and found enough arsenic in Samuel's system to kill a horse. Nanny was arrested in 1954, and when questioned, she laughed while confessing to the murders and even blamed it all on her bad luck in love, as if she hadn't personally expedited every single husband's trip to the afterlife. The authorities, probably freaked out by her giggling, locked her up for life. Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente looked like the picture-perfect sweet grandmother She was a frail little lady with white curls, oversized glasses, and the demeanor of someone who might scold you for not calling your mother enough. But beneath that granny exterior was a stone-cold serial killer with a shovel in one hand and a social security check in the other. You see, Dorothea ran a boarding house in the 1980s where she took in vulnerable people like the elderly, homeless, and those with disabilities. Except instead of just giving them a place to stay, she gave them a permanent resting place. She was basically a human Venus flytrap. However, she killed for profit. First, she'd find a vulnerable tenant and convince them to sign over their social security checks to her. Then she'd drug them into oblivion with sleeping pills or tranquilizers, or sometimes just strangle, smother, or poison them. She really mixed it up. And then when they kicked the bucket, this lady would just dig a shallow grave in her backyard, then keep cashing their checks like a serial killer CPA. The craziest part is that she got away with this scam and killed for years. Thankfully, her murder spree came to an end in 1988 when a social worker started looking into the disappearance of Alvaro Bert Montoya, a mentally disabled man who had been staying at her house. Well, when the authorities showed up and asked to search her property, Dorothea, still playing the part of a frail old lady, invited them to take a look. Because nothing says I'm innocent like a grandma offering cops lemonade while standing on top of a graveyard. And what did they find? Oh, just 7 bodies casually buried in her backyard. She was arrested, and at her trial, prosecutors painted her as a ruthless, money-hungry murderer, even though the defense tried to argue that she was just a kindly old woman who accidentally kept losing roommates. Thankfully, the jury wasn't buying it, and she was convicted of 3 murders, though she was suspected of at least 9. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and finally died in 2011. Level 3. Rosemary and Fred West. If there was ever a contest for most evil power couple, Rosemary and Fred West would have won by a landslide, except their landslide would have been covering another shallow grave in their backyard. You see, Fred West wasn't exactly Prince Charming unless your idea of a fairy tale involves a violent, creepy-looking man with the IQ of a rotting cabbage, and Rosemary West, on the other hand, was no innocent victim, but was every bit as ruthless, sadistic, and horrifying as her husband. Maybe even worse. This dysfunctional couple had a hobby that involved kidnapping, torturing, and murdering young women, and their targets were runaways, hitchhikers, and even their own kids. Basically, if you made the mistake of stepping into their house, your chances of leaving alive were about the same as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. Sadly, they were able to get away with it for so long because they kept up appearances. Rose even worked as a babysitter, and because their victims were often young women with troubled backgrounds, no one noticed right away when they disappeared. But eventually their luck ran out in 1994 when the police started investigating the disappearance of their 16-year-old daughter, Heather West. When the cops finally got a warrant to dig up the backyard, they found lots and lots of bones, and this was the final nail in their coffin. During trial, Fred confessed to everything, and they were both sent to prison for the confirmed death of 12 people, even though the police suspected the real number was closer to 30. Ed Gein. If you love horror movies, then you should be thanking Ed Gein because this guy was the inspiration behind a lot of the most insane horror movies ever produced. You see, Ed Gein was born in 1906 in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a town that was very plain, until Ed turned it into the horror capital of the Midwest. His childhood was basically a psychological horror movie waiting to happen because his mother, Augusta, was a Bible-thumping control freak who convinced Ed that women were evil, sex was a sin, and the only woman he should ever love was her. She isolated Ed from the world, fed him a steady diet of fire and brimstone sermons, and basically turned him into the human equivalent of a haunted house. So, when she died in 1945, Ed lost the only person who had ever controlled his life. Now, while most people would mourn, Ed decided to grieve by becoming a grave robber. And to make it even more disturbing, he would skin the corpse and turn them into freaking furniture. This guy had lampshades made from faces, a belt made from nipples, and even a full-on woman suit made entirely of human skin. For years, he was just stealing bodies, but he soon graduated into serial killings. He killed at least 4 women before the police decided to go to his house for questioning. It was there they discovered his home of horror, and, well, Ed wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind, so he just admitted to his whole offense. However, the guy was so mentally gone that he wasn't even put on trial at first, but just sent to a psychiatric hospital instead, where he spent the rest of his life. Amelia Dyer. If you thought the Victorian era was just about corsets and chimney sweeps, then you would be very wrong, because it also had baby farming, which sounds cute, but was actually horrifying. Desperate mothers would pay a baby farmer to take in their newborns, usually under the assumption that they'd be placed with good families. And Amelia Dyer, a kind-looking middle-aged woman with a warm smile offering salvation, was one of these baby farmers who promised mothers a good home for their babies. Sounds great, right? I mean, she basically invented the 1800s version of daycare, only her care would make even the Grim Reaper look like a babysitter in comparison. Because instead of finding the babies new homes, she found them a one-way trip to the Thames. That's right, she took the money and promptly murdered the infants using laudanum, a liquid form of opium, to overdose babies or simply strangle them with tape. The only thing she was farming was bodies. And, well, when things got suspicious, she changed her name and moved to a different town like some kind of Victorian serial-killing Batman, but evil and in a bonnet. Eventually, in 1896, the River Thames was getting way too crowded, and I don't mean with boats. And one of the packages was found floating in the water wrapped in brown paper. And like every bad serial killer in history, Dyer made a dumb mistake. She left a piece of paper with her address inside the package. So when police raided her house, they found mountains of baby clothes, adoption letters, and receipts proving she had collected payments from dozens of women. Authorities suspected she had killed at least 400 babies, which makes her one of the most prolific female serial killers in history. Thankfully, justice came swiftly as Dyer was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death by hanging on June 10, 1896. Her last words were, "I have nothing to say." Yeah, no kidding, Amelia. When you've murdered an entire kindergarten's worth of babies, there's really not much left to say. Level 4. Karl Denke. If Germany had its own version of Sweeney Todd, Karl Denke would be the headline act. This guy wasn't even your typical knife-wielding maniac, but was a respectable townsman who was known for his generosity, kindness, and mystery meat sales at the market. Denke, who was born in 1860, lived in Munsterberg and ran a boarding house that was supposed to house weary travelers in theory, but instead it turned out to be a revolving door of doom. Basically, any visitors that arrived there looking for shelter would leave in unmarked jars, and that was just the starter. First, he'd lure his victims into the home, kill them either by strangulation or a hammer to the head, and then butcher their bodies. Then he'd process the meat by either pickling or salting. And if that isn't already disgusting enough, Denke would sell these meats to people in the community. The guy had perfected the art of turning humans into pork and made use of every part of the body, from the skin, which he used to make belts and suspenders, to the bones, which he boiled for broth. He was basically the original zero-waste enthusiast, even though his idea of sustainability involved serving up the locals as bratwursts. The insane part was that this guy was well-liked by the community, considered an upstanding citizen, and even called Papa Denke by neighbors because of how cheap his meat was and how generous he was. Yeah, right. For years, Denke's operation ran without a hitch, but in December 1924, Denke made a huge mistake. He attacked a man named Vincenz Olivier who managed to escape and report him to the police. The police, likely thinking he was just another drunken fight, reluctantly went to Denke's house, and what they found was straight out of a nightmare. They found 16 femurs, skulls stacked neatly like collectible figurines, jars filled with pickled human flesh, and even handwritten recipes for cooking human meat. Denke never gave a full confession, but based on the body parts found, he's suspected of killing between 30 to 40 people over several decades. Mariam Solokiotis. So, for centuries, the church has been known as a sanctuary where you could go when the world feels like it's crushing you. There you could find peace, faith, and even a fresh start. But if you were unfortunately approached by Mariam Solikiotis, a 20th century Greek nun, then your fresh start would be happening 6 feet under. This woman, under the guise of a sweet old nun, lured and convinced hundreds of wealthy people to join her monastery and hand over their fortunes in exchange for a guaranteed ticket to heaven. Except the only thing she guaranteed was a slow, painful death. Once you joined her monastery, she'd cut you off from the world, starve you until you were weak and frail, and would withhold medical care so you could wither away slowly. What made her case so evil was that she did all these under the guise of piety. She used religion as a weapon to control and exploit people like some sort of spiritual Ponzi scheme. Over the course of her twisted reign, she was suspected of killing at least 177 people, even though there are reports that say the numbers are way higher. For years, Miriam's holy charade went unnoticed because, who would ever suspect a nun of running a murder-for-profit operation? But eventually, family members of the missing people started asking questions. And when the authorities started investigating, they found people tied up in dungeons, rotting away, and dying. They were corpses buried all over the monastery and documents with people's properties and belongings signed over to this crazy nun. She was arrested in 1950 and sentenced to life in prison. Fritz Harman, the Butcher of Hanover. Fritz Harman looked like your friendly neighborhood butcher, because he basically was. Born in Germany in 1879, Harman had an early knack for crime. He was in and out of jail for theft and fraud, but somehow kept dodging serious punishment. By the time the 1920s rolled around, Harman had upgraded from petty crime to murder, with a side of horror movie levels of cannibalism. He'd stalk train stations for young men, often runaways or drifters, looking for help, and once he lured them home, he'd kill them with something he called the love bite. Which sounds cute until you realize it meant biting through the victim's throat and tearing their windpipe out with his teeth. And once his victims were dead, Harman dismembered their bodies like a pro butcher because, well, he was basically a butcher, dumped the remains into the Lean River, and sold the rest to his customers. For a whole 5 years, Harman sold human meat to innocent people. But when over 500 pieces of human remains started washing up in the Lean River in 1924, the police finally decided to start investigations. The craziest part of this entire debacle was that Harman was a police informant himself, who had been snitching on criminals for years, which meant the cops never suspected he was actually the biggest criminal of them all. Well, when half the townspeople realized that most of the young men whose remains were found in the river were last seen with Harman, the police shone their light on him and Harman's darkness was exposed. He was sentenced to death by guillotine, and on April 15, 1925, Harman met the business end of a very sharp blade. Level 5. Moses Sitoli. If serial killers had a most likely to deceive you yearbook category, Moses Sitoli would have won it every time. Born in 1964 in South Africa, Sitoli's early life was the stuff of tragic villain origin stories. His father died when he was young, his mother abandoned him, and he was placed in an orphanage where he was allegedly abused. Now, this doesn't excuse what he did, because plenty of people have had rough childhoods without turning into full-blown murder machines, but it certainly set the stage. Now, as an adult, Sitoli looked like the kind of guy you'd trust. He was well-spoken, charismatic, and had that dangerous ability to seem normal, which for a serial killer is like having a VIP pass to unlimited victims. And in 1994, Sitoli's murder marathon began right after he was released from prison. His method was chillingly simple yet effective. First, he'd approach a woman, offer her a job, lead her to an isolated area, assault her, and then strangle her with her own clothing. By the time authorities caught on, Sitoli had murdered at least 38 women, dumping their bodies in fields around Pretoria, Johannesburg, and Boksburg. The media even dubbed his reign of terror the ABC murders because the bodies were found in towns that started with those letters: Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland. Even his murder spree had branding. The most terrifying part was that his victims were often young women who were simply looking for work. So this guy wasn't just a killer, but a predator who exploited people's desperation. By 1995, the police were desperately hunting him, and Satoli, proving he was both evil and dumb, decided to call a journalist and brag about his crimes. During the phone call, he not only admitted to the murders, but also mocked the police for failing to catch him. Well, the authorities, now laser-focused on him, launched an investigative manhunt, and Satoli was eventually tracked down in November 1995, and aptly shot in the leg when he tried to pull a knife as the officers attempted to arrest him. Alexander Pichushkin, chessboard killer. So, Alexander Pichushkin, aka the chessboard killer, was born in Russia in 1974 and grew up as a relatively quiet, lonely kid. But if horror movies have taught us anything, it's that quiet, lonely kids often grow up to do really messed up things. As a child, Pichushkin suffered a severe head injury when he fell off a swing, and that's when things started going south. After the accident, he became aggressive, impulsive, and obsessed with power. So as he got older, he developed an interest in chess. But instead of just playing the game like a normal person, he thought murder would make it much more fun. And just like that, Moscow had itself a real-life horror villain. Basically, Pichushkin would find a victim, invite them for a friendly drink somewhere isolated, smash their head in with a hammer, and then jam the vodka bottle into their head wound as some sort of personal signature. His method was as brutal as it was repetitive. Pichushkin's plan was to actually kill 64 people in order to fill an entire chessboard. Yeah, he was killing people as part of a chessboard game. Thankfully, or rather not thankfully, in 2006, he murdered a 26-year-old woman named Marina Moskolyova, and this was his downfall. Marina was different from his usual victims because she wasn't homeless, she wasn't a loner, and most importantly, she told her friends and family where she was going before she disappeared. In fact, Marina had even left a note for her son saying she was going on a walk with him. Well, police officers acted quickly, and soon enough they caught up with Pichushkin, who didn't even try to deny it. He literally smiled during his confession and acted like he was proud of his work. He even told investigators, and I quote, "For me, life without murder is like life without food." During his trial in 2007, he was charged with 49 counts of murder, which means he had actually managed to kill 49 people. And the scariest part was that he was just 15 moves away from checkmate. Ahmad Siraji. Born in Indonesia in 1949, Siraji worked as a self-proclaimed dukun, which is like a spiritual healer who dabbles in the fine art of making people believe in nonsense for money. But unlike the usual scam artists who just wave their hands and chant, this guy took things several steps too far. All because he believed that drinking the saliva of 70 murdered women would make him an unstoppable sorcerer. Yep, this guy woke up one morning and decided that drinking saliva was the elixir of eternal life and power. So, of course, to pull off these spit-fueled sacrifices, Siraji targeted women between the ages of 17 to 40 by claiming he could make their wishes come true. But first, they needed a cleansing ritual in a sugarcane field near his home. And get this, women actually loved this psychopathic con artist. Once they came, Siraji would lead them to the cleansing ground, make them lie in a shallow grave as part of the ritual, and then strangled them to death with a cable. This man would then bury these women straight up, facing his house after he's extracted their saliva. But like most serial killers who think they're criminal masterminds, Siraji got sloppy. One day in 1997, a young woman named Sri Kamala Dewey told her family she was going to see the famous sorcerer for spiritual assistance. And when she didn't come back home, her family immediately told the police. After a search party was launched, they found her body in the sugarcane field, buried in the same creepy, ritualistic way as his other victims. It turns out that this guy had successfully managed to kill over 42 women over an 11-year period. In 1998, Siraji was found guilty on 42 counts of murder and was sentenced to death by firing squad. In 2008, he was executed, finally putting an end to his saliva-stealing sorcery. Level 6. Luis Garavito. This guy was basically the Thanos of child murder, who successfully ended the lives of at least 193 children, though the real number is suspected to be over 400. Yeah, you heard that right, 400. Garavito was born in 1957 in Colombia, and let's just say he didn't grow up in a Disney movie. His childhood was a nightmare before he even became one, as he had a very abusive father and suffered from sexual and physical abuse throughout his teenage years. So, as he grew older, he developed a cocktail of problems, including alcohol addiction, uncontrollable rage, and a disturbing obsession with power and little boys. Starting in the early 1990s, Garavito took full advantage of Colombia's economic crisis and social instability. You see, the country was filled with homeless children, many of whom were ignored by the government and society, so this psycho would dress up in various disguises and lure the desperate young boys away by offering food, money, or gifts. He'd then take them to isolated areas where he would torture, brutally assault, and ultimately kill them. And the most gut-wrenching part in all these is that he even kept a notebook documenting everything. His killing spree lasted for 7 years across 13 Colombian states until the police finally caught him in 1999. That's right, 7 years. And the craziest part is that his arrest was just dumb luck. They had basically arrested him for attempting to assault a young boy, completely unaware they had just nabbed one of the worst serial killers in history. Once they started investigating, they found his creepy diary, souvenirs from his victims, and a map marking all his crimes. He was arrested and sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, but died of cancer behind bars in 2023. André Chikatilo. This guy was basically what would happen if nightmares had a baby with a Soviet horror movie. Known as the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, or Russia's worst grandpa, Andrei Chikatilo had what you could call a pretty messed up childhood thanks to Joseph Stalin's fun policies in Ukraine at the time. Well, Andrei grew up into a seriously messed up adult, and between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo racked up at least 52 victims. He often approached victims at train stations, bus stops, or near isolated paths, offering food, money, or a place to stay. And you already know the drill. Once they follow him, he'd attack by either stabbing, strangling, or beating them, and it'll just get worse from there. He didn't just kill the poor victims quickly, but would do everything in his power to prolong their suffering. He would stab repeatedly, targeting the eyes because he believed his victims' eyes would store his image, exposing him in the afterlife. Then when that's done, he'd often cut off body parts, bite chunks of flesh, and even eat organs. Despite the growing body count, the police were about as effective as a wet paper bag, all because the USSR didn't want to admit they had a serial killer. According to them, serial killers were a Western problem. So instead of finding the real psycho, they arrested over 100 random people, including a bunch of innocent men, some of whom were executed. At one point in 1984, the police actually arrested Chikatilo but let him go because he had a rare blood condition where his saliva and blood showed different types. So they didn't think he was a match for the killer, and while they scratched their heads, this guy killed another 20+ people. Eventually, he was recaptured once again in 1990, where he quickly confessed under the intense questioning. In 1992, Chikatilo went on trial, and on February 14th, 1994, he was taken into a soundproof room where he was shot in the back of the head. No drama, no last words, just boom, lights out. Level 7. Mikhail Popkov. Just imagine you're walking back home alone late at night in 1990s Russia. It only makes sense that you're a little scared, right? But what if a friendly police officer pulls up and offers to give you a ride home? You'd definitely feel relieved and safe. Well, unfortunately, if that cop was Mikhail Popkov, you'd have been better off walking, because this guy was the literal definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. By day, Mikhail Popkov was a police officer and a seemingly normal family man. But by night, he became a raging mad serial killer who preyed on women. And when I say preyed, I mean he brutally murdered at least 78 women. His coworkers had absolutely no idea what he was up to, his wife had no idea either, and his car is basically a murder scene on wheels. This guy just woke up one morning and decided that he'd start killing women who went out to drink because they were immoral and deserved to be punished. So, like a true psychopath, he would offer them rides in his police car and then take them to remote locations where he'd brutally attack and kill them. Because apparently nothing screams justice like drunk driving serial killers with a god complex. Worst part is that he didn't just kill them, he went overkill. Victims were raped, beaten, and mutilated. Some were even decapitated or stabbed dozens of times, and sometimes he'd use axes, screwdrivers, and knives on them first. It was horrific. And the creepiest part in all this is that he would still go home to his wife and daughter like nothing happened. For years, Popkov was hiding in plain sight between 1992 and 2010, and because he was a police officer, he knew how to avoid suspicion. The investigation hit dead ends for 2 decades, but eventually, DNA evidence became more advanced, and in 2012, Russian authorities decided to test police officers for a match. Guess who failed that test faster than a student who didn't study? Mikhail Popkov. And when he was confronted with irrefutable DNA evidence, he did what every guilty man does: pretend to be confused, denied, and then he spilled the beans. At first, he confessed to 22 murders, but later added 56 more to the list. By the time the investigators were done, his body count was officially confirmed at 78 victims, but he claims it's closer to 200. I mean, at this point, the man wasn't just a serial killer, he was competing for the Russian Murder Olympics. In 2015, Popkov was sentenced to life in prison. But because Russia has no death penalty, he gets to live out his days rotting in a Siberian prison. Pedro Lopez. If you're a young girl in Colombia, Ecuador, or Peru in the 1970s, you know that life was already tough enough. But when a man named Pedro Lopez came along, life became a nightmare. This man ruined lives on a catastrophic scale and a walking nightmare who redefined the phrase crimes against humanity with his absolutely ridiculous body count. Born in 1948 in Colombia, Pedro Lopez didn't exactly have a childhood filled with bedtime stories and warm milk. His mother, a sex worker, was reportedly abusive, and Pedro quickly learned that life was cruel. By age 8, he was already out on the streets, which, let's be honest, is not the kind of independent lifestyle any kid should have. He was later taken in by an American couple, but instead of becoming a heartwarming story about a lost boy finding a good home, he ran away and ended up in a life of crime. By the time he was a teenager, he was already stealing, assaulting, and basically being the human embodiment of a red flag. But while most criminals stick to robbery or gang violence, Pedro had bigger and way worse plans. When the 1970s rolled around, Lopez had fully evolved into a full-blown monster, and his targets were young girls between the ages of 8 and 12, because he was a predator of the absolute worst kind. Lopez used a mix of charm and deception, pretending to be a kind stranger, a traveler, or someone just needing a little help. He would lure his victims away, assault them, and then horrifically strangle them to death. And he didn't just do this once, twice, or 10 times. This man killed over 300 girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Let me repeat that for the people in the back. 300 victims. That's not a serial killer, that's a human extinction event. The most terrifying part about this man was that he might have kept killing indefinitely if not for one simple fact. Authorities in these countries were either too corrupt or too indifferent to notice. For years, missing children in these areas weren't taken seriously. Many of Lopez's victims were poor indigenous girls, which meant that law enforcement basically shrugged their shoulders and moved on. Think about it. If Ted Bundy had been running around the US with a 300-plus body count, there would have been documentaries before he even got caught. But Lopez was out here setting world records in murder, and authorities barely blinked. But thankfully, someone up there intervened and Lopez got sloppy. He tried to abduct a girl in broad daylight in 1980, but a group of heroic market vendors in Ecuador saw what was happening and went full angry mob mode on him. They grabbed Lopez and were about to deliver some swift street justice when the police intervened. And in prison, this man started bragging like a true psychopath. He confessed to killing hundreds of young girls like it was some kind of twisted resume, and when the police didn't believe him, he led them straight to a mass grave containing the bodies of over 50 of his victims. That's when they realized he wasn't kidding. Now, here's where the story goes from horrific to absolutely rage-inducing. Lopez was convicted in Ecuador with proof of his crimes. You'd expect life in prison, maybe even the death penalty. Nope. He got 16 years. That's not a mistake. The justice system in Ecuador had a maximum sentence of 16 years at the time, even for mass murders. This man slaughtered over 300 little girls and got less time than people get for insider trading. And it gets worse, because in 1994, after serving just 14 years, Lopez was released for good behavior. Yep, good behavior. A man who killed more children than some small towns even have was set free, and since then, the man has vanished because no one knows where he is now. So the truth remains, this monster is still out there.